Hi everyone, welcome to this video presentation entitled The Power of Story Now. It's a pleasure and a real privilege to be part of the Universidad de Otoño once again, and I do hope that you find our time together resourceful to you and for you, both inside and outside the classroom in the days, weeks and months to come. My name is Séamus Muircheartaigh, and I work as an NLP coach and trainer in both educational and business contexts. I design and deliver a wide range of innovative programs and trainings, and I offer coaching and mentoring to teachers, educators and learners, both one-to-one and with groups. But it wasn't always like that. So it's probably fair to say that whenever and wherever people meet, stories are told and have been told since the beginning of time. From cave paintings dating back to thousands of years to Hollywood blockbuster films, stories fascinate us. They draw us in, they move us, and they inspire us to act. Stories helped us stay safe as part of our evolution. Before the written word, we were telling stories to each other, and they have been used by generation after generation to pass on beliefs, morals and values, and they have always been a powerful tool for transmitting knowledge, education and learning. Stories are structured in such a way that they are easy to remember and pass on, and there is something incredibly compelling about a well-told story. Stories seem to satisfy some deep human psychological need for narrative, and while stories can entertain us, amuse us, delight us, disappoint or provoke us, most importantly, a great story can open our imagination and influence how we understand the world. When the CDL asked me to do this video presentation, I must admit I was particularly motivated and really excited to prepare and share it with you, as story is one of the areas that I see to be extremely resourceful in the process of managing training and fomenting learning, development and change, and transforming people's understanding of their world, and by doing so, enhancing the quality of their lives and their relationships with others. In this session, we will see how you can use stories to trigger good feelings, create optimal learning states, communicate values and beliefs, influence and motivate at a deeper level, and convey messages in a much more powerful way than through direct communication. I come from Ireland, and there the storyteller is called a Shanachie, and they used to travel from town to town telling stories, and they created a strong tradition which is still alive today. And that is where I'd like to start, with a brief story. In fact, a very personal story, and one that I'd like to share with you. It was actually just over 30 years ago that I first came to Spain, September 1990. I'd always wanted to get into teaching, particularly history teaching, because I really loved history at school. But when I left, my results didn't meet the grade, and I was really disappointed. So I ended up studying something completely different at university, though while it was pretty interesting, didn't leave me much scope to be able to teach in Ireland. Either way, after finishing university, I was playing drums in a semi-professional rock band for a couple of years, and after being on TV a couple of times and having had a single out, the band fell apart and eventually broke up. There were no jobs in Ireland at the time. This was well before the Celtic Tiger, and it was still quite a depressing country in many ways. And there, to be honest, the future was pretty bleak. So as you can imagine, that wasn't the best of moments for me either. It was then that I decided to train as a teacher of English as a second language. And after my month's initial training, I decided to head off to Spain. Boarding the plane, I had no job. No accommodation, no knowledge of Spanish whatsoever, and the only contact I had was the phone number of a friend who I'd never actually met. Today, with the internet and stuff, that would be so much easier, but when I think back to then, it seems as if I was being really naive and taking a massive risk. For me though, it was a bit of an adventure. But when I got here, it was as if I'd walked into enemy territory. I had no idea of the geography of Madrid, no idea of what people were saying, no idea of where to start. I got completely lost, and I ended up in a dodgy hostel near the centre of town. And it was all a bit scary, to be honest. Luckily enough though, not long after I'd arrived, I saw an ad in a national newspaper, and pretty soon I was in a teacher's room and preparing for teaching classes. All very well and good, but the first few months were really difficult. I had a new profession, a new set of colleagues, a new city, a new language to contend with. I had no sense of connection to the people, no sense of connection to the place or to the culture. I felt no sense of community. I really missed live music. I had no access to sport, and again, it all felt really depressing. And with Spanish, it was even more frustrating. I had learned French at school, studied Irish at university, got good grades, and I thought I was pretty good at languages. But this clearly wasn't happening for me. And again, I began to question myself. I couldn't distinguish the sounds, the grammar seemed really complicated, there were so many words, people sounded as if they were angry all the time, and between one thing and another, by Christmas, I was ready to throw in the towel. But I didn't. Over the holidays, I decided to give it one last go, and even still, after a couple of days back, I nearly had enough of the place, and again I was pretty much ready to go back home, but I didn't. Now, it wasn't until the end of January when I finally began to see some light at the end of the tunnel. I had found a connection, a sense of identity, a clear purpose for learning Spanish. There was a gap in my knowledge that I knew I wanted to fill, and not from a linguistic perspective, but from something a lot more powerful when it comes to learning, from an emotional perspective. Now, in the meantime, one of the things about the first school I worked in was that there were regular teacher observations. Now, the first observation I had didn't go so well, and for the second one I was pretty nervous, so I prepared really hard. I thought I'd done quite a good job making things clear, but as the class went on, I had the gut feeling that something wasn't right. Now, there were only 4 learners in the class, and pretty soon they were all yapping away in Spanish. I was beginning to get impatient as they weren't doing what I wanted them to. I didn't understand what they were saying, and I tried to get closer to see if I could work it all out. Anyway, a couple of minutes later, the director of studies who was observing me made a gesture to come to the back of the room. I started panicking in the inside, thinking I'd screwed up, my job was on the line, and I was going to be out the door. But he said to sit down for a second, and I did. And then he says, "Do you see that black thing up there at the top of the room?" Now, I didn't have a clue what he was talking about, because we were already using whiteboards at that stage. He says, "That black thing up there." Still didn't have a clue. "With the 4 legs," he says. And then he says, "What? The chair?" He says, "Yeah. Why don't you sit down and use it for a while and get out of their faces?" Now, that took me aback, big time, because it came across as quite abrupt, or at least that's what it felt like at the time. But it's a message I have never forgotten. It highlighted the importance of so many things that I began to become aware of over the years. One of the most important being to give the learner the space to be autonomous and independent, and that it's the learners who've got to do the work. And that advice still holds true for me today in my work as a trainer and coach. You know, I say to my coaching clients, you do the work. My job is to partner with you for you to find the resources for you to do the work. But at that stage, I was still full of doubt as to whether to stay in Spain or not. My idea had always been to stay in Spain for no more than 9 months and then go to Italy. Little did I know. So anyway, the real standout moment during all that time, and it will go with me to my grave, and it was the thing that helped turn everything around, was watching a football match in the Fondo Norte of the Vicente Calderón. Atleti had beaten Barça in the first leg of a cup semi-final and were losing at home, and it was pretty much touch and go as to who would qualify, until a goal from Manolo at the end, and I can still remember it, meant Atleti were going to qualify for the final, and there I was, watching the match of my own in the North Stand, when I jumped up only to be joined in the celebrations and the hugs with 3 or 4 people I didn't know from Adam. But Atleti were in the final. And at that point, I had a very clear idea that this could be my home. I felt so relieved. And I was off. I started picking up the sports newspapers, trying to understand the news, trying to pick up vocabulary, trying to learn some phrases, whatever it took, but with a sense of determination, resilience and urgency to get my level of the language to a place where I could at least understand the essential things about one of the things that has always been important to me, sport in general and football in particular. And that's a great message to give our learners. Find out what you're passionate about and link that to whatever it is you have to or you want to learn. Go above and beyond the content, because remember, learning is both logical and emotional. Learning is state related, and this is really important. Any new learning that you're going to have is going to be due to the specific emotional state you are in at the time that you're learning it. So get your learners excited, get your learners passionate, find out what their real needs are, what they really want, what they are motivated by, what they are passionate about, and you can use story as one way to help you communicate to that. Nancy Duarte, the writer of books such as Illuminate and Slidology, says that humans are hardwired to enjoy transformation, and that when we hear these stories, they engage the emotions in such a way as that we care and we are connected heart to heart. Now, it's been a long journey since those challenging beginnings with Spanish. Little did I know at the time what I would be able to do with those words, sounds and structures. It's only now, looking back, that I can really appreciate the opportunities those simple beginnings really gave me. And little did I realize how those learnings would be added to over time, and it's only later that the opportunities that would appear began to show up. Luckily enough, I've been very privileged over the years to be able to train in Spanish. I gave my first business coaching course, El Taller de Coaching, in 2011. In 2013, I ran a course for the CDL on Destrezas de Coaching para Profesores, and I have done a number of sessions and training courses in Spanish for a variety of different educational organizations. So what have been some of the things I have learned from that journey of exploration, discovery and change? Well, this is where the importance of using stories to foment learning and enable transformation comes in. So how do these kind of stories work? Stories are structured in such a way that they are easy to remember and pass on. They usually start off with something that happens to the protagonist, an incident that sparks it all off, which in one way or another knocks their life out of balance. A problem occurs that presents them with a major challenge, and because of that they have a goal to get the life they had back, or something that they want to move towards or achieve. So immediately there's a powerful sense of connection and empathy with the protagonist. We all know what it's like to want something, and we all know what it's like to have something get in the way of that. And there is also a sense of conflict, and that too gets us interested. It is this that grabs our attention. There is tension around what's going to happen next. There will be ups and downs along the way, a number of turning points. Things may be going well, and then the unexpected happens, which will up the tension, up the motivation to hear more, and cause an incredible desire to get to the end. Great storytellers make you want to hear more. So remember that our brains are hardwired, and we need to be able to find closure. That's why we are so motivated by soap operas and TV series. There's always a cliffhanger and some other twist in the story around the corner. And by the way, that's another really important thing when it comes to learning and training. And it's called the Incompletion Effect, which you'll already have seen in action in my story. So in the story, as the person goes through their trials and tribulations, they often learn from what's called the guide, the mentor, the wise sage, who helps them overcome their challenges, slay the dragon with some kind of advice or ideas. Oftentimes, it's the protagonists themselves who finds an inner strength or other resources when they dig deeper within. And sometimes it's an experience that they have and from which they can grow and learn. One way or another, by the end of our story, the protagonist is able to face the final demon, overcome the challenge, and live happily ever after. And as a result, they become a different character, a different person. Now, let's just take a moment to review just some of the reasons why it can be a good idea to use stories in the classroom. Firstly, we can use stories to create rapport and build connections between you and your learners. When people like and enjoy listening to you, they feel connected. And that was one of the reasons I chose the story I did. I'm guessing that some of you, well, probably most of you, will have gone through a similar process of learning or a similar process of language learning. So I'm hoping that you will have felt some empathy towards my situation, and that will have helped build some connections between us. Another reason for stories is to help you create states and evoke emotions. Looking back at my story, some of the states and emotions that I wanted you to feel were things such as disappointment, uncertainty, adventure, fear, frustration, connection, relief, determination, and finally a sense of gratitude. Now, with those emotions and states, I wanted you to go on an emotional roller coaster of a journey and to understand what it is like to begin to learn a language, so that again, if you could see that it was possible for me, it could also be possible for you. Linked to that, you can also use stories to anchor and trigger good feelings. Because people will remember the story and the feelings that the story invokes in them, when you bring up the story again, or when they remember it later, those good feelings will come back to them. Now, of course, you will need to consider what the good feelings you want to trigger are, and then how you can weave those good feelings into the story. Stories can be used to teach and provide learning. There were many learnings in the stories that I told you that I purposefully wanted to make. And here are some of them. First of all, learning is like going on an adventure that will inevitably have a lot of ups and downs. Also, when we are learning, there are times when you will have to take risks. And when learning, it's not always easy to see immediate results, especially when learning a new language. Oftentimes you'll feel very frustrated and lost, and that's an integral part of the learning process. Just as developing autonomy and independence is something that's also important in teaching and learning. And if you want to be successful in learning, find out what you're passionate about and link that to what it is you want to learn. Another important message is that learning is state-related, emotional as well as logical. And finally, you can never know fully the power of what you are learning as you are learning it. You can only become aware of all that you are learning as you add new learnings upon old learnings over time. You can also use stories to persuade and inspire. And there is also an important life lesson in the story I told you. And this for me is really essential. And that is, you can only interpret the present from the perspective of the future looking back. Any event that doesn't work out the way we want it to, we can only qualify it as a failure if we decide to stop the story. If we decide that the soap opera of our lives has finished and we ignore and discard the possibility of unexpected twists in the plot down the line that may well bring different consequences and results in surprising and amazing ways. Another use of story is to help solve problems. Stories can be used to help overcome blocks and resistance to learning. They can also be used to deal with personal challenges and help in the process of solving conflict. You can use stories to make people feel relaxed. You can use them at the beginning of the class to settle the class down. You can use them in the middle to help you change the focus, and you can use them at the end to help prepare for the next lesson. In that, you can introduce the topic of the next lesson through a story. Stories will also induce a light trance. You all know what it's like to relax after a long day and forget your worries, and stories will help you do just that. You can use stories to create an impression, to create an image of yourself in the minds of people. As you tell your stories, people will inevitably be forming an opinion about you. You will be sharing your perspectives on life, your values, what's important to you and for you, your priorities, etc. So when you tell your stories, you have that choice about exactly what it is that you want to share, exactly what you want people to know about you. We can't avoid this, and we do this all the time. It's just here with stories, you get to create and design them with a particular purpose and intention in mind. We can also use stories to reflect on life. It's probably fair to say that these are very challenging times, and we can use stories to look at our relationship with ourselves, our relationship with our family, our friends and colleagues. We can also consider how we see the world, how the world sees us, and what we want our future to be like both individually and as a society moving forward. So what does it take to be a good storyteller? Can you be a good storyteller? Can anybody be a good storyteller? What exactly does it take? Well, I would say yes, of course, you can be a good storyteller. In fact, you already are a good storyteller. In the Irish language, when two people meet each other in the street, or when they meet people they haven't met in a while, one thing they might say is céin scéal, literally translated as what story, or as we typically say in Ireland, what's the story? And I think that can be a nice way of understanding it. You see, basic storytelling is simply a matter of sharing news. We do it all the time with our family and friends. And as I said, for me, we are natural born storytellers because all the ingredients are already there. So for us as teachers, my suggestion is that we use some elements of our own experience to tell the stories that we need to share. So why not share some of our experiences with our learners? Now, some of you might think it's better to maintain your distance and keep your private life to yourself. And sometimes it is. And for me, if it's a thing that we ask our learners to talk about themselves in class, to share their opinions, or to write about what's important to them, shouldn't we as teachers be prepared to do the same thing? How can we really ask our learners to open up unless we are prepared to do that ourselves? So my motto is, go there first. Lead by example. So now there are two things that we need to consider about storytelling. First is the form, the structure of the story. The second thing we need to consider is the flow, how to tell the story so that it feels natural and engaging. Let's focus on the form first. So let's review the basic structure, and then we can look at specific questions you can ask yourself to prepare the kind of story that we're looking at. The basic structure of this kind of story starts with the protagonist. Life is fine. Then an enemy or challenge makes life difficult for the hero or the heroine. To help, they encounter the guide who teaches them something and helps them to overcome their challenge. Eventually, there is a final battle where the protagonist succeeds, and they live happily ever after. So the first thing you'll need to decide is who is the heroine or the hero in your story. Is it you? Is it somebody you know? Is it somebody else? Is it somebody famous? So then you'll need to decide, what is the problem? What is it that's getting in the way? What are the challenges and the obstacles that the protagonist is facing? With that in mind, you'll need to consider, what's the incident that kicks everything off? How does this challenge all start for the protagonist? Next up is, what's the goal? What does the protagonist want? What kind of life do they desire? What exactly is it that they are looking for? You'll also need to consider any turning points in the story. What are the ups and downs? What are the trials and tribulations that the protagonist has to go through? What pivot points might there be in the story? Most importantly to consider is the guide in the story. Who are they? What is their role? How do they help? What is so special about them? Alternatively, maybe the guide comes in the form of an experience which the protagonist goes through and which ends up changing the protagonist's life. Or maybe they find some inner strengths and resources themselves which help them to move forward. So next up is the final battle. What does the protagonist have to do to overcome their situation? How does the protagonist slay their dragon, and how do they feel after it? So as we come towards the end, you'll need to think about what life is like after the battle. How is life different now in Happy Ever After? It'll also be important to consider how the hero has changed and developed as a character as a result of having gone through the whole process. What kind of shifts and changes in thinking and action have happened as a result? And now, how has the hero or the heroine moved into a new and different future? And so now lastly, and most importantly, what have been some of the learnings that the protagonist has had, and how have these had an impact on them? So let's take a moment to review the questions. Who's the hero? What's the problem? What's the incident that kicks it all off? What's the goal? What pivot points or turning points might there be in the story? Who's the guide? What's the changing experience? What's the final battle? What's the happy ever after? How has the hero changed and developed as a character? And finally, what are the learnings? And now as we continue, I'd like to return to another important element of the form. So remember I said earlier that learning is state related, and that any new learning you have is effectively going to be glued to the specific state that you are in at the time that you are learning it. So since that is the case, as part of the structure, you'll also want to consider what kind of emotions and states you want your learners to feel. Now, one of the most important states in learning is curiosity. So then the question becomes, what stories can you find? What stories can you create to help develop a sense of curiosity in your learners? I want my learners to see learning as a discovery and exploration process. So the question again becomes, what stories can I tell to help foment that sensation in my learners? I want to see people understand learning as a process of experimenting, remembering that making mistakes is all part of the process, and only by that can we discover new things. And wasn't it Thomas Edison who replied when he was asked what it felt like to fail 1,000 times with the light bulb, that he hadn't actually failed, but that it was an invention that had 1,000 steps? Another story you could use here is the story of Michael Jordan and how all his failures are an essential part of his success. Another important point here is that confusion is also important in learning. If you are confused, it means you are learning. You are in the process of learning. You just haven't got everything sorted out yet. So what stories can you tell about confusion? When have you been confused? How did you work things out for yourself? Ultimately, I see learning as a process of playfulness and fun. How can you foment these attitudes in the classroom? What stories can you think of that can highlight these emotional states? And what about learning confidence? What stories can you tell that not only focus on knowledge, but also focus on self-esteem, self-image, and self-confidence? Another part of the form you'll want to consider are the resources that you'll need to include in your story. And by resources, I mean things that will help the learner to learn more effectively. And I mean learn in the widest sense of the word. You may want to include flexibility. You may want to include perseverance. You may want to include creativity. So what are some of the stories you can tell your learners about those kinds of resources? Are there any other resources that you feel are important to you and for you in the process of learning? And what stories can you tell about those? Again, when you think about the stories you want to tell, consider the messages you want to embed. And consider as well what impact and purpose you want your stories to have. You may have noticed during my story that there were a couple of occasions when I went off track and started telling a second story while still not having completed the first. This is another technique used in storytelling, where one story is nested within another. One of the reasons for how that can be effective is based on what's called the incompletion effect. The brain likes closure, but while the story is still open and incomplete, it means that the audience are even more motivated to stay connected and engaged. Now, let's spend a few moments talking about the flow. As I said before, we are natural-born storytellers. We tell stories every day to the people around us, so my suggestion is to start sharing some of those. But now as you do so, you will be choosing them with intent and with purpose, and that's the best place to start. Have a clear purpose. Remember also to get into the stage yourself. If you want to transmit curiosity, be curious. If you want to transmit excitement, be excited. Remember also to be the characters in the story. Really step inside their shoes. You can use your voice, use sounds, elongate your vowels, and play with the tone. Use all of the senses, and they will help you to transmit feeling and passion. Treat everything in the story as real. The more real it is for you, the more real it will be for your audience. Use the stage and use the space just like they do in the theatre. Have certain things happen in the different parts of the space you're in. If there are different characters in the story, speak from their point of view, and by doing so you'll make it easier for your audience to connect with them. Use suspense and choose when to pause and stop. Now, the last point I'd like to make for the moment is that true transformation happens when we change the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. What story are you telling yourself about yourself? Are you the villain or the victim? Or are you the hero or the heroine of your own story? What story do you want to create for yourself? But that, as they say, is a whole other story altogether. And so now, as we begin to bring our time together to a pause, there are a couple of questions I'd like you to consider, and I will give you a few moments to make some notes on each. First of all, how can you see yourself putting what you have been learning so far today into practice in the days, weeks, and months to come? Secondly, what are some of the things you are particularly curious and motivated to explore more deeply as you continue moving forward in your learning? So I'd just like to say thank you for taking the time to listen and watch this video presentation. I do hope that you begin to incorporate story into your learning, teaching and training, and I look forward to hearing how you do so. You can contact me by email at seamus@useyouredge.com or visit my website www.useyouredge.com. Take care. And in the words of one of my trainers, Dr. Christina Hall, NLP Meta Master Trainer, one of the best educators out there, enjoy yourself, enjoying others, enjoying you.